The iron gate was cold against Elizabeth's palms. Her bare feet ached against the stone driveway, every pebble pressed into her skin like a small punishment for what she was doing. The backpack on her shoulder was light, $200 in cash, her nursing scrubs folded into a tight square, her phone, and buried at the bottom, wrapped in a tissue like something she was trying to hide from herself, a pregnancy test with 2 pink lines. It was midnight. The Greenwich, Connecticut estate behind her was dark, 12 bedrooms, a private lake, 6 acres of manicured grounds surrounded by old-growth trees that blocked the house from every neighboring property. The kind of home that didn't just say money, it said power, it said legacy, it said you don't belong here. Elizabeth had memorized the security rotation 3 days ago. 2 guards walked the eastern perimeter every 45 minutes. The cameras on the south side of the property swept in a predictable pattern. She had 7 minutes to reach the gate, punch in the code she had watched one of the drivers enter last Tuesday, and disappear down the private road before anyone noticed her room was empty. She had made it this far. Through the silent kitchen, down the back hallway with its marble floors that turned every footstep into an announcement, past the fountain in the garden where the water had been turned off for the night, past the row of black SUVs parked along the circular driveway like sleeping animals, all the way to the front gate. She pressed the code into the keypad, 4 digits. She had replayed them in her mind 100 times. The keypad blinked red. Denied. Elizabeth pressed the numbers again. Slower this time, careful. Her fingers were shaking and she couldn't make them stop. Red again. Her stomach dropped. The code had been changed. Of course it had been changed. This was not a house that made mistakes. This was the Kang estate. Everything here was controlled. Everything was monitored. Everything was owned. Including, apparently, her. She grabbed the iron bars and pulled. The gate didn't move. It was electronically locked, bolted into a concrete foundation, topped with decorative iron spikes that curved inward like the teeth of something that didn't want to let go. She wasn't climbing this. She wasn't forcing this open. She was trapped. Then she heard it. Footsteps behind her. Slow, calm, unhurried. The sound of someone who had all the time in the world because the world was already his. Going somewhere, Elizabeth. She closed her eyes. Her grip tightened on the gate. The metal bit into her skin. The voice belonged to Kang Woo-bin, the man who owned this estate. The man who owned the hotels, the high-rises, the penthouse in Manhattan, the development projects in Beverly Hills and Scottsdale. A legitimate empire worth over $3 billion, built on Korean old money and American ambition. Woo-bin ran the American division of the Kang family's business portfolio, and he ran it with the kind of cold precision that made grown men in boardrooms go quiet when he entered the room. He was 34 years old. He had no wife, no public relationships, no warmth in his voice. And right now he was standing 10 feet behind the woman who was trying to run from him in the middle of the night. Elizabeth didn't turn around. She kept both hands on the gate. She could feel his presence behind her the way you feel a shift in temperature. The air changed when he was close. It always had. Woo-bin took another step forward. Then he stopped. He didn't speak right away. She could picture him without looking, hands in his pockets, dark eyes scanning, reading her the way he read everything, like a problem to be solved, like a contract to be reviewed, like a person who had just revealed something she was trying to hide. And that was exactly what happened next. "You're pregnant," he said. Elizabeth's breath caught. Her right hand had moved to her lower stomach without her realizing it, a reflex, an instinct she didn't even know she had developed. She had been doing it for days, touching her stomach when she was nervous, when she was thinking, when she was afraid. She hadn't noticed, but Woo-bin noticed everything. That was the terrifying thing about him, not his money, not his influence, his attention. When Kang Woo-bin looked at someone, he saw what they were hiding. Elizabeth finally turned around. The moonlight fell across her face. Her brown skin looked almost silver in the darkness. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. She was 27 years old, standing barefoot in a billionaire's driveway at midnight, and she was not crying. She had cried enough in the past 6 weeks. She was done with that. She looked at him. He stood in the shadow of the garden wall, dressed in black linen pants and a dark crew neck. No shoes either, she noticed. He had come after her in a hurry. That meant he had been watching, or waiting. "Let me go," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "No." One word. No explanation. No negotiation. Just the kind of certainty that came from a man who had spent his entire life being obeyed. Elizabeth felt something crack inside her chest. Not sadness. Anger. Because 6 weeks ago, this same man had stood in his study and told his younger brother that she was no one. A mistake. Something to be handled and discarded. And now he was standing at the gate telling her she couldn't leave. "You don't get to do this," she said. "You don't get to throw me away and then lock the door." Wu Bin's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Something heavier. Something that looked almost like pain. But Elizabeth didn't trust what she saw in his face anymore. She had trusted it once. She had let it pull her in, and it had cost her everything. The two of them stood there in the dark. The gate between Elizabeth and the rest of the world. Wu Bin between Elizabeth and the gate. And somewhere in the silence between them, a heartbeat neither of them had planned for. To understand how they got here, we need to go back 8 months. Back to the day Elizabeth Monroe first walked through this gate from the other side. 8 months before the gate, before the pregnancy test, before any of it. Elizabeth Monroe was working her second double shift of the week at a private medical clinic in Stamford, Connecticut. She had been on her feet for 14 hours. Her scrubs were wrinkled. Her sneakers squeaked against the clinic floor with every step. There was a dull ache behind her eyes that she knew was dehydration, but she hadn't had time to drink water since noon because 3 patients had come in back to back, and the other nurse on shift had called in sick. This was Elizabeth's life. Not glamorous, not dramatic, just relentless. She was 27, a registered nurse, licensed in the state of Connecticut. She had graduated near the top of her class from nursing school, which she paid for with scholarships, federal aid, and a stubbornness that her grandmother called your mother's gift and your mother's curse. Her mother had left when Elizabeth was 9, just walked out of their apartment in Bridgeport one morning and never came back. No note, no phone call, no forwarding address. Elizabeth's grandmother, Dolores Monroe, raised her after that. Dolores was a retired school cafeteria worker with bad knees, a sharp tongue, and a belief that every problem in life could be solved with prayer, hard work, and a pot of rice and beans on the stove. Elizabeth sent money home to Dolores every month, $300, sometimes $400 when she could manage it. She drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked side mirror. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Stamford that smelled like the Thai restaurant below it. She ironed her scrubs every night before bed because she believed that looking professional was the first form of self-respect. Dolores had taught her that. On this particular afternoon, Elizabeth's supervisor, a woman named Priya, pulled her aside near the supply closet. "I have something," Priya said. "A private client, live-in nursing care for post-surgical recovery." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. Live-in. Room and board included. The patient had a severe car accident about 3 weeks ago, shattered left femur, 3 fractured ribs, concussion. He was discharged from the hospital against medical advice and has been recovering at home. He's fired 4 nurses in 2 weeks. Why? Because he's difficult. How difficult? Priya hesitated. The pay is $15,000 a month. Elizabeth blinked. She made $4,800 a month at the clinic after taxes. $15,000 was more than 3 times her salary. It was enough to pay off the last of her student loans, enough to build a real savings account, enough to stop worrying about whether she could cover Dolores' medication costs and her own rent in the same month. Where? Elizabeth asked. Greenwich. Who's the patient? Priya handed her a folder. Elizabeth opened it. The patient's name was Kang Wu Bin. There was a medical summary, a list of current medications, and a photograph that had been taken for hospital records. The man in the photo had dark hair, a strong jaw, and a bruise running from his left temple to his cheekbone. Even injured, even in a hospital gown, there was something about his face that made Elizabeth pause. Not attraction. Not exactly. Something more like recognition. Like looking at someone, and knowing immediately that they were used to being in control and hated that they currently weren't. She took the job. 3 days later, Elizabeth drove her Honda Civic through the gates of the Kang estate in Greenwich for the first time. She had looked up the address beforehand, but nothing prepared her for seeing it in person. The driveway was a 1/4 mile long, lined with oak trees that had to be at least 100 years old. The house appeared gradually, like it was revealing itself on purpose. A 12-bedroom stone and timber mansion with dark shutters, ivy climbing the east wall, and a front entrance flanked by 2 stone planters the size of small cars. There was a private lake behind the house. She couldn't see it from the driveway, but she could see the light reflecting off the water through the trees. There were manicured gardens, a carriage house that had been converted into a multi-car garage, and a security presence that was subtle but unmistakable. 2 men in dark clothing near the east wing, a camera above the front door, another camera at the gate she had just driven through. Elizabeth parked her Civic next to a black Range Rover that probably cost more than her apartment. She grabbed her duffel bag and walked to the front door. It opened before she could knock. A Korean woman in her 60s stood in the doorway. She was small, sharp-eyed, and dressed in a simple black dress with a white collar. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun. She looked at Elizabeth the way a border guard looks at a passport. "Elizabeth Monroe," the woman said. "Yes, ma'am." "I am Mrs. Cho. I manage the household." She stepped aside to let Elizabeth in. The foyer was enormous. Polished stone floors, a staircase that curved upward like a question mark, fresh flowers on a console table that looked like it belonged in a museum. Mrs. Cho led Elizabeth through the house without small talk. She pointed out the kitchen, the staff quarters, the medical supply room that had been set up on the first floor. Elizabeth noticed that the house was immaculate but cold. Beautiful furniture, perfect lighting, not a single personal photograph anywhere. It looked like a showroom. It felt like a place where no one actually lived. When they reached the bottom of the staircase, Mrs. Cho stopped and turned to Elizabeth. "He will try to make you quit," she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact. "Don't let him." Then she led Elizabeth upstairs. Woo Bin's bedroom suite was at the end of a long hallway on the second floor. Mrs. Cho knocked once and opened the door without waiting for a response. He was sitting upright in a king-sized bed, propped against pillows, his left leg in a black stabilizing brace that ran from his ankle to his upper thigh. He wore a gray t-shirt and dark sweatpants, and his dark hair was pushed back from his face in a way that suggested he hadn't looked in a mirror and didn't care. The bruise from the hospital photo had faded to a yellowish green along his temple. 3 prescription bottles sat on the nightstand beside a glass of water and an untouched plate of food. He looked at Elizabeth. His expression was flat, assessing, completely unimpressed. "I don't need a nurse," he said. His voice was low, controlled, and carried the faintest trace of a Korean accent that surfaced on certain consonants. It was the voice of someone who was used to saying things once and having them obeyed. Elizabeth set her duffel bag down by the door. She pulled a pair of latex gloves from her pocket and snapped them on. She walked to his bedside and picked up the first prescription bottle. Oxycodone. She checked the dosage, then checked the number of pills remaining against the fill date. "Your medical file says otherwise," she said, not looking at him. "You have a hairline fracture in your 3rd rib that hasn't set properly because you keep moving when you shouldn't be. Your physical therapy schedule has been ignored for 9 days. And based on these bottles, you're self-managing your pain medication without any supervision, which tells me you're either stubborn or reckless." She paused and looked at him. "Probably both." The room went silent. Mrs. Cho, still standing in the doorway, pressed her lips together in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Woo Bin stared at Elizabeth. Nobody in his world spoke to him like that. Not his staff, not his business partners, not even his father, who communicated displeasure through silence and financial consequences rather than direct words. "You have 30 days, he said quietly. "I have as long as your bones need," Elizabeth replied. "Now sit up straighter. I need to listen to your breathing." She pulled a stethoscope from her bag and pressed the cold disc against his chest through his t-shirt. He flinched slightly, not from pain, from surprise, from the fact that she had simply walked in and taken over, like his authority in his own bedroom meant absolutely nothing to her. And that was how it started, not with attraction, not with sparks, with a power struggle between two people who were both used to being the strongest person in the room. Over the next 2 weeks, Elizabeth established a routine and enforced it without apology. She woke Woo Bin at 7 every morning for vitals. She adjusted his diet based on his recovery needs, cutting out the heavy Korean dishes Mrs. Cho prepared and replacing them with lean proteins, vegetables, and bone broth. She ran his physical therapy sessions herself, forcing him to do exercises he hated and ignoring his complaints. She reorganized his medication schedule and locked the prescription bottles in a cabinet to which only she had the key. Woo Bin resisted every step. He canceled morning check-ins. She showed up anyway. He told her to leave his room. She told him she would leave when his oxygen levels were where they should be. He called her stubborn. She called him a difficult patient with poor compliance. He told her she was overstepping her role. She told him her role was to get him healthy, not to make him comfortable. He stopped arguing after the first week, not because she won, but because somewhere in the middle of all that resistance, he started looking forward to her showing up. By the 3rd week, Elizabeth began to understand the world she had stepped into. The Kang family was not just wealthy. They were a dynasty. Woo Bin's grandfather had started a construction company in Seoul in the 1960s. His father, Kang Sung-ho, expanded it into a real estate empire that stretched across Asia. When the family moved into the American market in the early 2000s, Woo Bin was sent to run the U.S. division. He was 26 at the time. He built it into a $3 billion portfolio of luxury developments, high-rise residential towers in Manhattan, commercial properties in Beverly Hills, resort hotels in Scottsdale. Every deal bore his fingerprints. Every success was expected. Every failure was unforgivable. His younger brother, Kang Jun-seo, was 2 years behind him. Jun-seo ran the family's hospitality brand from a sleek office in Midtown Manhattan. He was the public-facing sibling, the one who did interviews with Forbes, the one who showed up at industry events in perfectly tailored suits with his hair styled and his smile rehearsed. Where Woo Bin was silent and surgical, Jun-seo was charming and visible. Jun-seo visited the estate during Elizabeth's 3rd week. She was in the kitchen preparing Woo Bin's afternoon medication when she heard the front door open and a voice fill the foyer like someone had turned on a television. "Hyung, you look terrible, that's the spirit." Elizabeth stepped into the hallway. Jun-seo was standing at the bottom of the staircase, shrugging off a navy overcoat. He was shorter than Woo Bin, leaner, with a face that was designed to make people trust him. He saw Elizabeth and his smile shifted slightly, not wider, sharper. "You must be the new nurse," he said. "They said you lasted longer than the others." "I'm Elizabeth," she said. "Jun-seo, the better-looking brother, don't tell him I said that." He winked and headed upstairs. Elizabeth didn't like him. She couldn't explain why immediately. It wasn't anything he said or did. It was something in the air that changed when he arrived. Woo Bin became different, colder, more guarded. His jaw tightened and his answers became shorter, like he was rationing words. She also noticed, over the following days, that Woo Bin had no personal visitors other than Jun-seo. No friends who stopped by, no girlfriend, no old college buddies. His phone rang constantly, but every call was business. His bedroom had no photographs, no keepsakes, no evidence that anyone in his life had ever given him something just because they cared about him. The man lived in a 12-bedroom mansion and occupied it like a hotel room. Functional, temporary, empty. One night, Elizabeth was doing his late evening vitals check. His ribs were healing well, but his mobility was still limited, and she needed to rewrap his compression bandages every night. She was sitting on the edge of his bed, her hands moving carefully around his torso, layering the elastic bandage over his bruised ribs. The room was quiet. A single lamp was on. His breathing was steady under her hands. Then she felt him tense, not from pain, from the proximity. Her fingers were on his bare skin, moving slowly, and something in the room shifted. She looked up. He was already looking at her. His dark eyes were unguarded for the first time since she had arrived. There was something raw in them, something that looked like loneliness wearing the mask of control. "When's the last time someone took care of you?" she asked, not as a nurse, as a person asking another person a real question. Wu Bin didn't answer. He looked away. His hand, resting on the edge of the mattress, tightened into a fist. Elizabeth finished the bandage in silence. She gathered her supplies. She said good night. She walked to the door. "Elizabeth." She stopped. "Thank you," he said, 2 words. But from Kang Wu Bin, they sounded like they cost him something. That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She went downstairs and found Mrs. Cho sitting alone in the kitchen, drinking tea. The older woman looked up as Elizabeth sat down across from her. They sat in silence for a while. Then Elizabeth asked, "The car accident, what really happened?" Mrs. Cho's hands tightened around her mug. She didn't answer for a long time. Then she spoke in a low, careful voice, like she was choosing each word the way you choose steps on thin ice. "It wasn't an accident. Someone tampered with the brakes on his car. The mechanic found it. The family knows. Wu Bin knows." Elizabeth felt cold. Did they find out who did it? "He told everyone to let it go." "Why would he do that?" Mrs. Cho looked at her. There was sadness in the older woman's eyes, the kind of sadness that comes from watching someone you care about hurt themselves. "Because he thinks he deserved it," Mrs. Cho said. Elizabeth stared at her. The words sat between them like something heavy that had just been placed on the table. She didn't ask anything else. She wasn't sure she wanted to know more, but something had shifted inside her. Something that told her the man upstairs was carrying something much heavier than fractured ribs. It happened slowly, then all at once. By the 5th week, Elizabeth and Wu Bin had developed a rhythm. Mornings were clinical. Vitals, physical therapy, medication review. Afternoons were quieter. He worked from his study while she charted his progress on her tablet, and sometimes an hour would pass without either of them speaking, but neither of them left the room. It was the kind of silence that meant something. The kind that said, "I don't need you to talk. I just need you to be here." She started making his tea the way he liked it without being asked. Green tea, no sugar, steeped for exactly 3 minutes. She didn't know when she had memorized that. He started asking her opinion on things that had nothing to do with medicine. What she thought about a property his company was considering in San Jose. Whether she thought the renovation of the East Wing guest rooms was worth the investment. She answered honestly, and he listened, and neither of them acknowledged that this had nothing to do with nursing care. One evening during physical therapy, Wu Bin tried to walk unassisted for the first time since the accident. Elizabeth was standing beside him, hands ready to catch him. He gripped the back of a chair, shifted his weight to his healing leg, and took 1 step, then 2, then 3. On the 4th step, his leg buckled. Elizabeth caught him, her arm went around his waist. His arm landed on her shoulders. They were pressed together, face to face, breathing hard. She could feel his heartbeat against her chest. His hand gripped her shoulder and he didn't let go. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was the kind of kiss that happens when 2 people have been pretending for weeks that something isn't building between them and the pretending just collapses. Elizabeth kissed him back. She felt it in her entire body. The relief of it, the danger of it, the undeniable certainty that she had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She pulled away first. She stepped back, helped him sit down, checked his leg brace, and said good night. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed with her head in her hands. She knew what this was. She knew the math. He was her patient. He was her employer. He was one of the most powerful men on the East Coast, and she was a nurse from Bridgeport who was sending $300 a month to her grandmother. The distance between their lives wasn't a gap. It was a canyon, and she had just walked to the edge and jumped. But she couldn't take it back, and over the next few days, she stopped trying. They talked late at night in his study, real conversations, the kind neither of them had with anyone else. He told her about growing up in Seoul, about his father's expectations, about being sent to America as a young man with a mandate to build something that would make the family proud, and a quiet understanding that failure was not an option. He told her about his mother, who died when he was 12, and how his father never mentioned her name afterward. He told her about the loneliness of being the eldest son in a family that treated legacy like religion and love like weakness. She told him about dolars, about her mother leaving, about studying for her nursing boards in a laundromat in Bridgeport because her apartment had no heat that winter and the laundromat was warm and open until midnight. She told him about the day she got her nursing license and drove straight to Dolar's house, and they both sat on the porch and cried. They were from different worlds. Everything about their lives was different. Everything except the loneliness. That was identical. That was the thing that recognized itself across every barrier between them. They spent a night together, not rushed, not reckless. It was two people who had been holding everything together for everyone else, finally letting go with each other. The narration doesn't linger on the details. It doesn't need to. What matters is what happened afterward. The next morning, Woo Bin was different, softer. He brought her coffee. He touched her hand across the kitchen counter and let his fingers stay. When she looked up at him, there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not control, not authority. Fear. The kind of fear that comes when you realize you've let someone in and you know that means they can hurt you now. Elizabeth saw it, and she felt something tighten in her chest because she recognized that look. She had seen it in her own mirror, and she knew, with the kind of instinct that came from a lifetime of being left, that this wasn't the beginning of something safe. This was the beginning of something that could break her. Junsi arrived at the estate on a Wednesday evening, unannounced. He walked in like he owned the place. Technically, his family did, but the way he moved through the house was different from Woo Bin. Woo Bin occupied his home the way a general occupies a command post. Junseo strolled through it like a guest at someone else's party, touching things, smirking at the decor, making small comments that sounded like compliments but felt like measurements. He stayed for dinner. Mrs. Cho prepared kimchi jjigae and grilled galbi, and the three of them sat at the long dining table in a silence that was shaped like a conversation nobody was willing to start. Junsi glanced between Elizabeth and Woo Bin throughout the meal. His eyes were sharp and amused, like he was watching a show he had already predicted the ending to. After dinner, Elizabeth excused herself to prepare Woo Bin's evening medication. She was walking down the second-floor hallway toward the medical supply room when she heard voices from the study. The door was slightly open. She should have kept walking. She knew that, but something in Junseo's tone made her stop. "You're sleeping with the help, Hayoung." Junseo's voice was casual, almost bored, like he was commenting on the weather. "That's a new low even for you." "Watch your mouth," Woo Bin's voice, cold, tight. "Father already knows. I didn't tell him if that's what you're thinking. Staff talks, drivers talk, you know how it works. He's furious. He's talking about restructuring leadership of the American division. And you know what that means." A pause. "It means me." Silence. "You're handing me the keys, Hayoung, because you can't keep your hands off a nurse." More silence. Elizabeth's hand was flat against the wall. Her heart was hammering so hard she was afraid they could hear it. Then Woo Bin spoke. His voice was flat, stripped of everything. "She's no one. It was a mistake. I'll handle it." Elizabeth stopped breathing. Her knees went soft. The hallway seemed to tilt. She stepped back from the door, 1 step, 2. Then she turned and walked to her room on autopilot. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall. "She's no one. It was a mistake." She played the words again in her head. She tested them for hidden meanings, for context, for some interpretation that would make them hurt less. There wasn't one. He had said it plainly, in his own study, to his own brother, without hesitation. Elizabeth did not cry. She had burned through all her crying years ago, on a porch in Bridgeport, waiting for a mother who never came home. She just sat there and felt something inside her close, like a door being locked from the inside. The next morning, everything changed. Woo Bin didn't come to breakfast. Mrs. Cho delivered a message instead. She stood in the doorway of Elizabeth's room with an expression that was hard to read and said, "Mr. Kang's recovery has progressed to the point where live-in nursing care is no longer required." Your final paycheck will be deposited by Friday. A car will take you home this afternoon." Elizabeth nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Cho." She packed her things. It took less than 20 minutes. She hadn't brought much. She hadn't planned to stay long. She zipped her duffel bag and carried it downstairs. She walked through the foyer, past the kitchen, past the hallway where she had heard the words that ended everything. She stopped outside the study. The door was open. Wu Bin was standing at the window with his back to her, his weight on his good leg, his hands at his sides. He was looking out at the grounds. The morning light fell across his shoulders. Elizabeth stood in the doorway and waited. 5 seconds, 10, 15. He didn't turn around. She walked to the front door. A black sedan was waiting in the driveway. The driver put her bag in the trunk. She got in the back seat and closed the door. The car pulled down the long driveway. The gate opened automatically. Elizabeth didn't look back. But what she didn't see, what only the staff inside the house witnessed, was what happened the moment her car disappeared down the road. Wu Bin turned from the window, walked to his desk, and slammed his fist into the surface so hard the wood cracked down the middle. The sound echoed through the house. Mrs. Cho, who had been standing in the hallway, appeared in the doorway. She looked at the cracked desk. She looked at Wu Bin's hand, already swelling. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," she said. Wu Bin didn't answer. He stood there with his broken desk and his broken hand and his broken judgment and said nothing, because he knew she was right. 6 weeks passed. Elizabeth went back to her life. She returned to the clinic in Stamford. She picked up extra shifts. She sent money to dolers. She drove her Honda Civic and ironed her scrubs and ate dinner alone in her apartment that smelled like pad thai from the restaurant downstairs. She did not contact Wu Bin. He did not contact her. She told herself she was fine. She told dolers she was fine. She told Priya she was fine. She told the bathroom mirror she was fine. She was not fine. The nausea started in the 6th week. At first, she dismissed it as stress. Then it got worse. She couldn't keep breakfast down. The smell of coffee made her gag. She felt exhausted by noon and dizzy by 3. She missed her period. Then she missed it again. She bought the test at a CVS on her lunch break, paid cash, and told no one. She took it in the bathroom of her apartment at 11 o'clock at night, sitting on the edge of the tub with the door locked even though she lived alone. 2 pink lines. Elizabeth sat on the bathroom floor for 45 minutes. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there with the test in her hand and stared at the tile and let the reality settle over her like a weight being placed on her shoulders 1 pound at a time. She was pregnant with Kang Wu Bin's child, the man who had called her no one, the man who had let her walk out of his house without a word. The man whose world was made of boardrooms and family dynasties and iron gates and power structures she didn't belong in and had never been invited into. She considered every option. She weighed every path, and then she made her decision. She was keeping this baby. Not because of him, because of her. Because dolers had raised her alone and done it with grace and grit and love, and Elizabeth knew in her bones that she could do the same. She didn't need the Kang family's money. She didn't need Wu Bin's permission. She needed what she had always needed, herself. She did not contact him. She refused to be the woman who came back with a pregnancy test and an open hand. If he wanted her, he knew where she was. And since he hadn't called in 6 weeks, the message was clear. But 2 weeks later, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was not. "Elizabeth," Mrs. Cho. The older woman's voice was strained, thinned out, like she had been debating whether to make this call for days. "His health has deteriorated. He pushed himself too hard. The rib fracture has re-aggravated. He's refusing treatment. He won't see any of the doctors his family sends." "That's not my problem anymore, Mrs. Cho." A pause. "He hasn't been the same since you left. He won't say it. He would rather die than admit it. But I've known that boy since he was 8 years old and his mother was still alive. I know what breaking looks like on him, and he is breaking." Elizabeth closed her eyes. She leaned against the kitchen counter in her small apartment and pressed her hand against her stomach. "I can't," she said. "I'm not asking you to save him. I'm asking you to do what you do. You're a nurse. He's a patient who needs help, nothing more." Elizabeth hung up. She stared at the phone. She looked at the pregnancy test, still sitting on her bathroom counter because she hadn't been able to throw it away. She pressed both hands against her face and breathed. 3 days later, against every instinct, every promise she had made to herself, every wall she had rebuilt since the night she heard those words through that study door, Elizabeth drove her Honda Civic back to Greenwich, Connecticut. The gate opened when she arrived. Someone was expecting her. She parked in the same spot beside the same black Range Rover. Mrs. Cho met her at the front door. The older woman looked at Elizabeth for a long moment, then said, "Your room is ready." Elizabeth told herself 1 week. She would stay 1 week, stabilize his recovery, reestablish the physical therapy protocol, make sure the rib was setting properly. Then she would leave and never come back. She would not tell him about the pregnancy. She owed him nothing. But keeping a secret from Kang Woo-bin was like hiding fire in a glass house. He noticed things. He noticed that she avoided coffee, which she used to drink every morning. He noticed that she rested her hand on her stomach when she thought no one was looking. He noticed that she turned pale at certain smells and excused herself quickly. He noticed the way her body had changed, subtle but present, the slight fullness in her face, and the way her scrubs fit differently. He didn't say anything, not yet, but his eyes followed her everywhere, watching, calculating, putting pieces together the way he put together business deals, patiently, relentlessly, until the picture became clear. And then one night, the picture became very clear. This is where the story catches up to the beginning. This is the night everything broke open. Elizabeth had been back at the estate for 3 weeks. She had kept her distance. She was professional, clinical. She arrived for vitals in the morning, ran his therapy sessions, checked his rib alignment, and left. No late-night conversations. No tea in the kitchen. No moments in the study. She built a wall between them out of medical jargon and clipboard notes, and she did not let it crack. But she made one mistake. She left the pregnancy test in the bathroom of her guest suite. She had been keeping it at the bottom of her bag, wrapped in tissue, like a secret she was carrying alongside the other secret growing inside her. That evening, she took it out and looked at it. She did this sometimes, not because she needed confirmation, because holding it made it feel real in a way that her body hadn't caught up to yet. She set it on the bathroom counter while she showered, and then she forgot it. One of the housekeeping staff found it during the evening cleaning rotation. The young woman, unsure what to do, brought it to Mrs. Cho. And Mrs. Cho, whose loyalty to Woo Bin ran deeper than her loyalty to anyone else in the world, went to his study and told him. Elizabeth didn't know any of this. She only knew that during dinner that evening, Woo Bin looked at her differently. He sat across from her at the dining table, his chopsticks resting untouched on his plate, and he watched her with an expression she had never seen before. Not cold, not warm, certain, like a man who had just found the last piece of a puzzle he had been working on for weeks. Her stomach dropped. She couldn't explain why, but something in the way he looked at her told her the ground was about to shift. She made her decision that night. She would leave, tonight, right now, before he could say whatever he was about to say, before he could react to whatever he now knew. She had survived being called a mistake once. She would not survive it again, not now, not carrying his child. She waited until midnight. She packed her bag. She crept through the dark house. She made it to the gate. And now the audience is back where the story started. Her bare feet on the driveway, the cold iron, the red keypad, his voice behind her. "You're pregnant." Elizabeth turned around. Her body was shaking, but her voice was steady. A lifetime of holding herself together when everything was falling apart had trained her for this moment. "Yes," she said, "I'm pregnant, and yes, it's yours, and no, I wasn't going to tell you. Because the last time I stood in this house, you told your brother I was no one. You said I was a mistake. You let me walk out without a single word, so I don't owe you this, I don't owe you anything." Woo Bin stood very still. The moonlight cut across his face. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides. He didn't move toward her. "I lied to Jun Seo," he said. Elizabeth shook her head. "Don't." "I lied because if my father found out what you meant to me, He would have used you. That's what he does. He finds the thing you care about and he holds it over you until you comply. I sent you away because keeping you close put a target on you, and sending you away was the worst thing I've ever done." Elizabeth's eyes burned. "You don't get to decide what protects me. I'm not a chess piece in your family's game. I'm not something you move around a board to keep your empire running." "I know," he said. "I know that now." He stepped closer. He didn't touch her. He looked at her stomach, then back at her face. His expression was stripped bare. No armor, no control. Just a man standing in his own driveway in the dark, terrified of losing the only real thing he had ever had. "Don't leave," he said. "Not like this. Not in the dark. Give me a chance to be the man you needed me to be 3 months ago." Elizabeth stared at him. She searched his face for the lie, for the performance, for the calculated move. She couldn't find it, and that scared her more than anything. Because it meant he was telling the truth, and the truth meant she had to decide whether she was brave enough to stay. She turned back to the gate. Her hand rested on the cold iron bar. Then she let go. She didn't walk back to the house. She sat down right there on the stone driveway, exhausted, overwhelmed, and done pretending. Wu Bin looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down next to her. The stone was cold beneath them. The sky was clear. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Elizabeth said, "If you ever call me a mistake again, I will walk out of this gate and you will never find me." "I won't," he said. "Promise me." "I promise." They sat there until the sky began to lighten. Two people on a driveway in Greenwich, Connecticut, with an iron gate behind them and something fragile and terrifying between them. Not a fairy tale, not a fantasy. Just two flawed, stubborn, lonely people choosing each other in the only way they knew how. Imperfectly, but completely. The peace lasted 11 days. On the 12th day, Kang Sung-ho flew in from Seoul. Wu Bin's father was 70 years old. He was tall for his generation, thin, and carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had never in his life slouched or second-guessed himself. His silver hair was cut short. His suits were dark. His face was a mask of permanent composure that hadn't cracked publicly in 40 years. He had built the Kang Empire from a mid-level construction firm into a multinational real estate conglomerate, and he had done it by being smarter, colder, and more patient than every person who ever sat across from him. He arrived at the Greenwich estate in a black car with no advance notice. Mrs. Cho opened the door and bowed. Sung-ho walked into the house, looked around like he was inspecting a property he was considering purchasing, and said, "Where is my son?" The meeting took place in the study. Elizabeth was not invited. She sat in her room on the second floor and heard nothing, because the study was on the opposite end of the house and the doors were solid oak. But she saw Wu Bin's face afterward. He came to her room and stood in the doorway, and his expression told her everything she needed to know. "He wants me to end this," Wu Bin said. "Us, the pregnancy, everything." Elizabeth felt her stomach clench. "What did you say?" "I said no." "And?" "He gave me an ultimatum. End the relationship or lose control of the American division. He'll transfer leadership to Jun Seo." Elizabeth looked at him. "That's your life's work." "You're my life," he said. And then he looked almost surprised, like he hadn't planned to say it. Like the words had escaped from somewhere he usually kept locked. But Sung-ho was not a man who made empty threats. Within 72 hours, things began to move. Jun Seo, sensing opportunity the way a shark senses blood in the water, sided with their father and began making moves behind Wu Bin's back. He held meetings with board members in New York without Wu Bin's knowledge. He flew to San Jose to meet with tech investors on a deal Wu Bin had been developing for months. He contacted the family's legal team in Seoul to begin drafting restructuring documents. Jun Seo was trying to take everything, and he was using Elizabeth as the justification. Then he made it personal. During a trip to Palo Alto, California, where the Kang family was finalizing a major tech campus development, Jun Seo found Elizabeth alone. Wu Bin was in a separate meeting across the city. Elizabeth was at the hotel, reviewing prenatal health materials on her laptop, when Junseo sat down across from her in the hotel restaurant. He smiled his polished smile. He ordered sparkling water. He looked at her with the expression of a man who believed he was doing her a favor. "I'll offer you $2 million, he said. "Clean, untraceable, walk away, disappear, raise the child however you want, but remove yourself from this family." Elizabeth looked at him. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She set her laptop down and folded her hands on the table. "I grew up with nothing," she said. Her voice was calm and even. "I put myself through school with nothing. I built my career with nothing. So when I tell you that I don't need your family's money, you should believe me." She leaned forward slightly. "And when I tell you that I'm not going anywhere, you should be afraid." She stood up and walked out. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had seen the flicker in Junseo's eyes. Not fear. Something worse. Determination. The look of a man who had just decided to stop playing nice. Within a week, Elizabeth's life began to unravel in quiet, surgical ways. Her background was being investigated. A reporter from a tabloid blog contacted the clinic in Stamford asking about her employment history. Her landlord called and said someone had been making inquiries about her lease. Her social media accounts, dormant and private, were being followed by unfamiliar profiles. Someone was building a file on her, digging for scandal, looking for debt, criminal history. Anything that could be twisted into a story about a gold digger targeting a billionaire family. Elizabeth told Wu Bin. She sat him down and laid it out calmly, the way she would present a medical chart. The calls, the inquiries, the investigation. His reaction was terrifying, not because he yelled. He didn't. His voice got quieter. His movements got slower. His eyes went flat and dark, like windows being shuttered from the inside. Elizabeth had seen Wu Bin angry before. This wasn't anger. This was the cold, focused clarity of a man who had just identified a threat to the one thing he refused to lose. "I'll handle it," he said. And he did. Wu Bin didn't respond with chaos. He responded with precision. He hired the most aggressive legal team in New York. He retained a private investigation firm, and within 3 weeks he had compiled a file of his own, a file on Junseo. It turned out that Junseo had been skimming money from the family's hospitality division for over 3 years. Not enormous sums. Carefully disguised amounts funneled through shell companies and inflated vendor contracts. Enough to constitute fraud. Enough to end a career. Enough to shatter the Kang family name if it ever became public. Wu Bin flew to Seoul. He walked into his father's office in the Kang corporate headquarters. He set the file on the desk. "Junseo has been stealing from the family for 3 years, Wu Bin said. "Every transaction is documented. Every shell account is traced. Every dollar is accounted for." Sung-ho opened the file. He turned the pages slowly. His face didn't change. He read for a long time. "If you force me to choose between Elizabeth and this family," Wu Bin continued, "I will choose her. And I will release this file to the board, to the press, and to every investor we have. The Kang name will survive a scandal about who I love. It will not survive a scandal about who stole from it." Sung-ho closed the file. He set it down. He looked at his son. A long silence, the kind of silence that reshapes families. "You've become ruthless," Sung-ho said. "I learned from you," Wu Bin replied. Another silence. Then Sung-ho leaned back in his chair. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not defeat. Recognition. The old man was looking at his son and seeing, for the first time, someone who was willing to burn the house down to protect what mattered. And in the Kang family, that was the only language that earned respect. "Bring her to Seoul," Sung-ho said quietly. "I want to meet the woman who turned my son into a man." 6 months later. The Greenwich estate was different. You could feel it the moment you walked through the gate, which stood open most days now, no longer locked like a perimeter around something fragile. The house had changed the way a face changes when someone stops clenching their jaw. Warmer, lived in, real. Elizabeth was 8 months pregnant. She moved through the house slowly these days, one hand often resting on the curve of her belly, the other holding a mug of ginger tea that Mrs. Cho prepared fresh every morning without being asked. She had redecorated 2 rooms on the first floor, nothing dramatic. A few photographs on the walls, a shelf of books in the study that were hers, not his. A throw blanket on the couch in the living room that was soft and bright yellow and clashed with everything in the room, and Wu Bin hadn't said a word about it because he liked seeing her things mixed with his. It made the house feel like a home instead of a headquarters. Dolers had moved into the guest cottage on the property. It was a small stone building near the garden, originally used for staff housing, now renovated with new windows, a modern kitchen, and a porch that faced the morning sun. Dolers spent her days tending a small garden she had planted along the south wall, growing tomatoes and herbs, and talking to the plants like they were old friends. When Wu Bin visited her in the afternoons, which he did more often than anyone expected, she told him he was too thin and needed to eat more. He sat on her porch and drank her coffee and didn't argue. It was the first time in his life that someone treated him like a regular person. No deference, no fear, no agenda. Just an old woman in a garden telling him his posture was bad and his Korean was improving but still terrible. He loved it. He would never say that out loud, but Elizabeth saw it in his face every time he came back from the cottage. Something lighter, something unlocked. Jun Seo had been reassigned. After the file was presented to Sung Ho, a quiet reorganization took place within the Kang corporate structure. Jun Seo was moved to a minor operational role in the family's Seoul office. On paper, it was a lateral transfer. In practice, it was exile. He and Wu Bin did not speak. The file was never released. Wu Bin kept his word. He had used it as leverage, not as a weapon. That had been Elizabeth's influence. She had told him, during one of their late-night conversations after the Seoul trip, power isn't about destroying people. It's about choosing not to. He remembered that. He carried it with him the way other men carried grudges. Elizabeth had left bedside nursing. Not permanently, but for now. She was using her medical background and her savings, supplemented by funding that Wu Bin provided but that she insisted be structured as a formal grant with her name on the paperwork, to launch a nonprofit health clinic in Bridgeport, her hometown, the place she had grown up, the place where women like her mother had needed help and hadn't had anywhere to go. The clinic would focus on maternal care for low-income women, prenatal checkups, postnatal support, mental health resources, parenting classes, a place where someone who was scared and pregnant and alone could walk in and be treated with dignity. "This is mine," Elizabeth had told Wu Bin when they reviewed the paperwork together. "Your money helps, but this is my name on the door, my vision, my community." He looked at her and nodded. "Everything good in my life is yours," he said. She rolled her eyes. "That's the hormones talking." "That's me talking." "Well, you sound ridiculous." He smiled, a real smile, the kind the staff had never seen before Elizabeth arrived. The kind that made Mrs. Cho shake her head in the hallway and mutter to herself that she had been right all along. Sung Ho visited one final time. He flew in from Seoul on a Thursday and stayed until Sunday. He was quieter than Elizabeth expected, less imposing in person than he had been in her imagination. He sat with her at the kitchen table on the second morning of his visit and asked about her grandmother, her work, her plans for the clinic. He listened without interrupting. He asked follow-up questions that were precise and thoughtful. He didn't apologize for opposing her. He didn't acknowledge the ultimatum he had given Wu Bin or the damage Jun Seo had tried to do. Kang Sung-ho was not a man who apologized, but he showed up. And for a family that communicated through actions rather than words, showing up was the closest thing to saying I was wrong. On the last day of his visit, before the car arrived to take him to the airport, Sung-ho handed Elizabeth a small wooden box. It was old, dark lacquered wood with a subtle floral pattern inlaid in mother of pearl. "Open it," he said. Inside was a jade bracelet, deep green, smooth, cool to the touch. Elizabeth held it carefully. "My wife wore this when she was carrying Wu Bin," Sung-ho said. His voice was steady but quieter than usual. "For the child." Elizabeth looked at him. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that matched the weight of the moment, but her throat was tight and her eyes were stinging and she just nodded. Sung Ho nodded back. Then he turned and walked to the car. It was enough. Sometimes the biggest things passed between people in the smallest moments. A box, a bracelet, a nod. 20 years of silence about a dead wife broken by a single gesture toward the woman who was about to give his son a child. The final scene takes place at the gate. It is morning. The sun is up. The October light in Connecticut has that golden quality that makes everything look like a painting. The leaves on the oak trees along the driveway are turning red and orange, and the air is crisp and smells like earth and something sweet. Elizabeth is standing outside the gate, not running, not escaping, just standing there, waiting for a delivery of supplies for the clinic that was being shipped to the estate. She is wearing a soft gray sweater and leggings and slippers that belong to Wu Bin, and her belly is large enough now that she has to stand with one hand braced against her lower back. She hears footsteps behind her, not rushed, not careful, just familiar. Wu Bin comes up behind her and wraps his arms around her, carefully. His hands resting on her belly. She leans back into him. His chin rests on the top of her head. They stand there for a moment. The gate is open. The driveway stretches out ahead of them. The world beyond the estate is bright and loud and complicated and theirs. "You know," Elizabeth says, "the last time I stood at this gate, I was trying to run from you." "I remember," he says. "Barefoot, in the dark, with $200 and a pregnancy test." "I remember that too." She tilts her head back to look up at him. "And now, I'm trying to figure out where we're putting the car seat in the Range Rover." He laughs, a real laugh, full and unguarded. The kind of laugh that carries through the open windows of the house and reaches the kitchen where Mrs. Cho is preparing breakfast. The older woman pauses, listens, and shakes her head with the smallest smile. "About time," she mutters. In the guest cottage, Dolores is watering her tomatoes. She hears the laugh, too. She looks up toward the main house, nods to herself, and goes back to her garden. And at the gate, Elizabeth and Wu Bin stay exactly where they are. Not because the gate is locked, not because she can't leave, but because she doesn't want to. Because for the first time in her life, the place she's standing is exactly where she belongs. Elizabeth Monroe once stood at this gate barefoot, terrified, and alone. She carried nothing but a secret and $200 in cash. She thought love was something that happened to other women, women with easier lives, softer landings, louder last names, women whose mothers stayed, women who didn't have to iron their own scrubs and study in laundromats and count every dollar twice. She was wrong. Love didn't find her because she was lucky. Love found her because she refused to be broken. She ran from a man who wasn't ready, and when he became ready, she was brave enough to stay, not because she needed him, but because she chose him, and he spent every single day after that making sure she never regretted it. The gate stayed open.